All right, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the Kickstarter Roachmill, and joining us will be Tom McWeeney. He's one of the creators, and so without further ado, I'll bring him in, and we'll find out about a little bit about himself and about the Kickstarter. Hey Tom, how's it going?
Good. How's it going with you?
Hanging in there, hanging in there.
Aren't
So
we all?
yeah. So before we get started talking about the Kickstarter, I like to kind of see, ask a little history of, my guests and ask if they may like remember maybe the first comic book they read, or maybe the first comic book that, kind of caught
Hmm.
their attention and made them want to read more.
Yeah. No. No. I have very, very clear memories of sort of my indoctrination into comics. I mean, I grew up with three older brothers, none of which were into comics. They were all into sports. And there was a woman across the street who had an older son, and he was getting ready to move out of the house, and she just walked this box across the street to my mother, figuring, okay, she's got a bunch of boys, they'll probably want these. And it was a big box of comics, and it was all like Mort Weisinger DC comics. So it was, for people who don't understand, it's like it was all like Superman as an Indian chief on the cover, or Batman like on the street corner with like a cup and selling pencils because he was out of money. It was like these really silly, very sort of like Batman
Silver
TV
Agey.
show. Yeah, yeah, very. I mean, but they were brightly colored, and I
Yeah.
was whatever 5 years old, so I poured through these. But in that box was one Marvel comic, and it was Tales to Astonish '86. And I'm going through all these goofy, wacky DC comics, and I cracked this Marvel comic open, and here's this. The opening splash page was, I didn't know at the time, but it was like Bruce Banner on like basically a nuclear bomb about to land in New York City. And I'm from New Jersey. So it's like, hey, wait, this takes place in New York. And my father works in New York. And I thought that was so cool versus like, Gotham City and Metropolis. And and then the Hulk showed up, and I was suckered in forever because it was just like, hey, he doesn't wear a cape, and he has no real weapons, and he's not particularly charming, or there was just this a massive appeal to this sort of simplicity of that character. I also think growing up sort of the youngest of four boys, it's like, yeah, this would be pretty cool to be able to turn into this guy. So that was it. Then I also got very lucky. Within a year or so of getting that box, a kid moved in across the street from me, who I was sort of internally grateful for, because he not only was a massive comic fan, but his grandparents spoiled him. So every single time he went out, he'd come back with like a stack of he was a big Marvel fan too, of Marvel comics. So what I couldn't afford to buy, I could read over at his house.
Hmm.
So that was it. So I was, I was buying Hulk pretty much. That was pretty much all I could afford at the time, and he was buying everything else: Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Avengers. And so I was like, oh wait, all this stuff interconnects, and then little by little, I began to sort of get a view of this universe, and I total Marvel head my whole life ever since. So.
And so, what got you? I mean, obviously your love of comics, but what kind of made you want to, start, doing your own?
Well, I told you I had three older brothers. And the second oldest, my brother Jim, from a very early age, he could draw, and he could draw really well. And so I used to sit there and watch him draw, and it was almost like a magic trick to me as a kid. And we were also big fans of like we had Mad Magazine in the house. We had all these sort of trade paperbacks of like Dennis the Menace strips and Beetle Bailey, and so we were comic strip fans as well. And he would draw the comic characters, the strip characters, and I was just like, this is so cool, like. And so that, watching him draw combined with you know reading comics all the time, I was like, hey, wait a minute, I want to draw these things.
Hmm.
It just was this sort of natural progression, which was, I'm going to try to draw the characters I like versus, you know, my brother Jim, who was drawing like Don Martin characters out of Mad, or he would he was a great character, so he would do caricatures of like movies we were seeing at the time. He would, very like more Trucker influenced. So I was like, hey, I'm gonna start trying to draw the Hulk because that's who I liked. So, you know, I would copy panels out of, you know, Herb Trimp Hulk books all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and then little by little it just progressed to, hey, I'd get a pad, and then I would just start drawing panels and start going, I'm going to do my own stories. And so it was just, you know, sort of a natural, you know, it was like that whole thing where like that, you know, opportunity and interest combining, you know, it was a cheap hobby. And so my parents were like, yeah, sure, we'll buy you pencils and we'll buy you pads. It's, you know, it's not like we have to buy you football equipment or anything, you know. so yeah, so my brother was a massive influence on, he was the single influence on making me actually go, I could draw. Like I watch him do it. So if he can do it, you know, getting rid of that sort of like fear of like not being able to do it.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
So, you, besides the Kickstarter, you've also done work in the industry. Is that correct? Kind of, you know,
Yes.
tell us about how your history within the industry itself.
Right. Well, the brother I just mentioned,
Hmm.
both he and I went to the Kubert School at the same time from
Okay.
83 to 86. He was kind of kicking around doing sort of odd jobs, and I was getting ready to graduate high school, and I got very lucky in that I was going to go to an art school over in Philadelphia, and I brought my portfolio there, and I can't think of like how the planets aligned in this one moment where my parents really weren't that interested in the Kubert School because, you know, it's like nobody, my parents didn't know who Joe Kubert was. It didn't look like a legit school. We had gotten the information in the mail, and they just kind of like, do we really want to spend money on this? And I went to this portfolio review at this Philadelphia College of Art, and the one guy who just happened to look at my portfolio went, yeah, you know, this is really good stuff, and we could certainly help you, but it's all cartooning. And then he just turned to my mother and went, have you looked into the Joe Kubert School? And I'm not kidding you. That guy opening his mouth not only got me there, but got my brother there as well. And so we went together, and it was a great experience. I can't say enough about, you know, just how it taught sort of like not only the skills to draw comics, but what became infinitely valuable once we got out was it taught the grind of comics. You know, I don't know if it changed after we left, but the amount of work they threw at us was just like kind of like what you have to do to be a freelancer. You know,
Hmm.
we were working 7 days a week when we weren't in school. Our weekends were drawing pages or pinups or whatever the assignment required. So coming out of the school, I was pretty prepared to, you know, do that. And while I was there, one of the fellow student was this guy, Rich Hedden. And in third year, as we were getting ready to graduate, I always sort of gravitated toward Rich because I recognized two really key things in him that were very different from me, which was Rich was a really strong idea guy. Like I wasn't. I was just like, yeah, hey, tell me what to draw and I'll draw it. But Rich was just like ideas would just fall out of him. Like it was like a superpower even really. And the other thing I liked about Rich was he really, really, really loved the storytelling aspect of comics, but he also had a good sense of humor. Like he would really love Frank Miller and admired him, but he didn't want to write Frank Miller comics. You know, he
Hmm.
wanted, you know, he did. We were both big Miller fans. Who wasn't back in 1986? But he had a much more of like a Will Eisner kind of sense of humor where, you know, it's all right to put a little humor in your books. And in third year, we were sort of saying, hey, you know, we should sort of pair up together. You know, he hated inking, and he you know, so it was like, okay, we'll work together. And I'll never forget. In third year, he cracked open a sketchbook right before spring break, and he said, I have this idea, and he showed me this sketch of what turned out to be Roachmill. and it was a guy dressed all in black with four guns and two huge sort of bug arms coming out of his back. And I looked at it and I was like, okay, what is this? And he went, yeah, this character I've created called Roachmill. And then he says to me, he goes, yeah, he's an exterminator. He works in pest control. And there was just something so sort of like, how could you not like a guy who's like comes into your house to kill your bugs, who's also part bug? Like there was just something sort of, it was so incongruous that I just started laughing. I was like, okay, I'm on. Let's work on this. So we both went home on spring break, and he started sort of coming up with some ideas, and I just started sketching like crazy, most of which didn't wind up in the book, but I created kind of the peripheral around this character. I created a lot of the side characters. I started thinking about a little bit. Rich is very much about like what happens in individual issues, whereas I'm kind of the nerdy guy that thinks of like how to make it work, So like I would come up with stuff like, okay, so he's an exterminator and people can hire him to kill, like I said, rats in their basement, but they can also hire him to kill, the noisy next door neighbor if they want. And I said to him, we need some sort of logical way this can kind of work. So I started working on like, how did this come about? How did things become so lax? And so we started working on the prehistory, and then like Rich is we're both big fans of like cop procedural movies, like police pursuits. So I said, gotta have the police involved somehow. Like maybe when he's hired to kill somebody, he has to sort of clear it with the police first. So there's this sort of like, they're sort of at odds with each other. The cops don't really like the exterminators, and the exterminators don't really like the cops, but they're sort of, pushed together by this sort of bureaucracy. And Rich liked that. So while we never really delved deeply into that, there's little bits and pieces of that in the issues that we did wind up doing. So we were a good fit because Rich would come up with just sort of the crazy basic ideas for stories. And then I would kind of go in there and we would brainstorm it. And I would say, put something like this in there. It'll make it a little bit more, for lack of a better word, believable, or, and so that's it. So we graduated, we started working on, actually we didn't, other than that sketchbook, what people got to understand is that 1986 was such a great period to be a creator in comics. It was the Wild West. 5 years earlier, Pacific, Comico, First Comics, all came out of nowhere. And so if it had been 5 years earlier, our only option would have been Marvel or DC or self-publish. And we were just not good enough to get into Marvel or DC. We weren't. But now all of a sudden we had these other options. And with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles coming along and just basically making all these small publishers go, hey, we can do black and white books cheap. Now all of a sudden we had an avenue. So we went to a comic convention in June in New York City, just armed with a sketchbook and a verbal pitch. And within 2 hours, we had a tentative deal with Blackthorn Comics out of California, just looking at our sketchbook. The guy said, we did have to submit an official proposal with like character sketches and whatnot, which took us about 2 or 3 weeks to put together. But we went to this convention in June, and by late August, early September, we were working on issue number 1. Like that could never happen now. I mean, it's just, the industry's just not structured like that anymore. And no, it was great. Like it was, to be 20, we were 20 years old. I mean, we just graduated school.
I was 6.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like we graduated not thinking, oh, here we go. And don't get me wrong, we were paid next to nothing to do Roachmill for Blackthorn, and we did it for a year. We did 6 issues for Blackthorn, and after the 6 issues, I said we can't do this anymore. So we shopped it around, and now there was even more companies to shop it to. So Dark Horse really liked it, and they picked it up, and we went from making no money at Blackthorn to making just enough money to like live at home with our parents, pay our car insurance, and have like enough to go to the movies on Friday night. So it's like Dark Horse paid us a little bit better, but it was still it was still our formative years, you know, where we had to sort of pay our dues, so to speak.
Hmm.
But they were great times. I mean, we were just, you know. So I mean, the big shift for us was after doing Roachmill for a few years was when we got our first uh, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle work, because that actually paid, and
Hmm.
you know, it was good money. And I remember my father looking at my first turtle check and going, "Oh, okay, he can make a living at this." I mean, I'm
Yeah.
dead serious. My father was an accountant, and
Hmm.
my parents were very, very cool. Like, always supported my art, always were behind me. But we were like 3.5 or almost 4 years into Roachmill now, not really making any money, not making any real traction, and I could sense he was starting to get the, you know, maybe you should start looking for another job.
Right.
He never said it to
Yeah.
me, but the vibe was there. And then he saw my first turtle check, and it was like, oh, okay. So I have nothing but love for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for that alone, you know.
Hmm. So, what else have you done with in the for other comics besides Roachmill?
But we did Roachmill, and we did the Turtles for a while, and then we wound up working on the Demon at DC, which was again something that could never happen now, where we literally we were at a convention in New York, and Rich Hedden was talking to I believe it was Evan Dorkin, and Evan just was sort of laughing at the fact that DC was trying to get him to do a Lobo book. You know, this was during that period where you know DC just could not do anything right, and you know, here they get a hot character in Lobo, and rather than just immediately doing what Marvel would do, which is give him his own book, for almost 2 years, all they did was have him sort of guest spot in other people's books to bump up the sales. So they essentially eroded the sort of, you know, goodwill fans had for the character. So Evan Dorkin's just sort of railing about this, about how, like, you know, yeah, if you had called me 2 years ago, I would have done one, blah, blah, blah. So Rich Hedden goes, I'd like to do a Lobo book. So he just cold called Dan Raspler at DC, one of the editors, and Dan was like, "No, I can't give you a Lobo book, but the creative team for the Demon is leaving. Or, you know, would you be interested in that?" So like, yeah, sure.
Hmm.
So we did the Demon for a year. It was not a particularly pleasant experience. It was fine, and it was a good steady paycheck, and it was also sort of good to get in the door at a company like DC, a big company. Got to meet Archie Goodwin, which was great. You know, one of my idols. I always thought he was an amazing writer. And as the Demon was wearing down, of course, the whole Image thing was picking up, and it was just that point where Rich and I just decided maybe it was time to sort of like go off in our own directions. And I had met an editor at when I worked at DC, Bill Kaplan, who was sort of in talks to take over Wildstorm at Image, Jim
Hmm.
Lee's company. And he came to me. Actually, he didn't come to me. He called me at home one day, and he was just like, "Hey, DC's going to offer you a contract soon to ink. Don't sign it." It's literally what he said to me. And I was like, "Okay, Bill, why not?" And he's like, "Because I'm probably going to be editor in chief of Wildstorm, and I want you to come to Wildstorm." And I was like, that is much more appealing to me. And the
Yeah.
reason why it was much more appealing, again, this is what people don't sort of understand. And this is, you know, I was working at DC, and my editor loved me. I met all my deadlines. He was, you know, he was a good editor. But DC had such a rigid, sort of old school mindset about everything. Um, and I would go in and I would drop off pages to my editor, and I would say to him, you know, "Hey, Dan, you know, I see you're doing a new, you know, trading card set. Any chance, you know, I can get some trading cards?" And he'd be
Yeah.
like, "Yeah, sure, you can get some trading cards." And I'm like, "No, I mean to pencil and ink myself." "Oh, well, I don't know. I don't know, I'll have to talk to somebody.
Hmm.
And they wouldn't let me draw anything, you know? And I realized it's like, I was an inker to them. That's it. And it's all I was ever going to be at DC was an inker. And I was like, I'm not, you know, I'm like, so I knew my chances were better with Wildstorm. I'm thinking not only might I get to pencil, maybe I'll get to write some stuff. And that turned out to very much be the case.
Hmm.
It was a much, much better creative environment than DC. Um, and my 5 years at Wildstorm were, without question, the sort of best 5 years of my comic book career. And as it turned out, sort of the end of my comic career, because I wound up getting an injury that sort of stopped me from inking. But
Oh, I'm sorry.
it's a long story. I don't want to bore you, but I wound up sort of damaging nerves in my neck, and it
Hmm.
affected my drawing hand. And so I just couldn't. I could still draw, I could still do artwork. I just could not do the grind that a
Right.
a 17-page comic book every month is. But no, Wildstorm was great. I mean, it really was. It was it was great in that you could come up with an idea and then you could just walk into your editor and go, hey, I have this idea, and they'd be like, all right, I'll run it by Jim.
Hmm.
And then 2 days later it'd be like, nah, he's not really into that, or sure, go ahead, start it. It was really like that. Like Marvel and DC were not like that at all. Marvel was closer to that, but DC not at all. you know
So let's jump forward to the present and talk about the Kickstarter.
right.
So I mean, you've kind of explained, kind of the origin behind Roachmill.
Well, the origin really, I mean, if you is again 1986, um knee deep in grim and gritty comics, the old you know cliche that ever said, which is true. I mean, Frank Miller, the Punisher, was gaining a lot of ground. So it in a sense it was a little bit like snarky 20-year-olds sort of putting together a book that was sort of a little jab at that.
Yeah,
Not it's not it's done with a lot of love. It's not a mean-spirited comic, but it is a little like, Rich going, hey, if the Punisher really, what would sort of be the natural progression of like a guy like the Punisher running around New York City?
yeah,
What would be the sort of, you know, and so that's sort of where it came from, and then it just
sure.
became something very much different than that.
And so the Kickstarter is that it look it's a is it's a collection of all the issues, correct? For the
It is a collection, yeah. It's a collection of the first Kickstarter is for Volume 1, which is the Blackthorn issues, which
Mhm.
have been reprinted one other time before by Dark Horse. But the idea is that if there's enough interest and we can do Volume 1, then we're going to go on to Volume 2, do all the Dark Horse books. And if actually the Dark Horse books would probably require a Volume 2 and a Volume 3 at least, because not
Mhm.
only was there eight Dark Horse issues, but we did a couple short stories. We did one kind of mini, like mini issue where it was like a 15-page story. So there would be a lot more. And then the idea would be, if we do get into a Volume 2 or particularly a Volume 3, that Rich and I have been discussing maybe doing some new material for it, whether that be another short story or another sort of full issue. We're unsure at this stage. It's still way too early, but the big demand for people that sort of approach me on Facebook all the time is, when are we going to do new material? And I always said, nobody's paying for new material. So if this is a case where we genuinely feel there's enough interest, and even if we're not going to make a lot of money off of it, that's fine. I would be glad to do new material if I felt that um, the fan base warranted it,
Right.
you know.
No, definitely.
But I mean, people have been saying to me for a long time, I think this is a point that needs to be made. Um, for years, they've been saying to me, hey, how come you're not doing any Roachmill anymore? How come when are we going to get some new Roachmill? And I would say to them, this all the time that, that I had no interest in doing Roachmill again. And they would be, like, why? And I'd be like, well, I said, what started off as kind of a parody of not only the sort of grim and gritty comics of, Frank Miller and Alan Moore and all those guys, but also to sort of a lesser degree and not an intentional satire, sort of a little bit of a poke fun at the sort of gun mentality in this country. But again, this was in 1986.
Mm-hmm.
In Roachmill's world, it's very much like sort of old Detroit in RoboCop, where it's, crime running rampant. Everybody is armed. Everybody, like you go down to the supermarket and you can buy milk, bread, and a, AK-47. And in 86, that was kind of funny because it was sort of over the top. In 2022, we're sadly incredibly close to that, and certainly closer than I ever thought we would get. And so I was like, what started off as satire, it's not really satire anymore. It's not really funny anymore.
Right.
But I was talking to a friend who said, that's all the more reason you should reprint it. And I was like, really? He's like, yeah. He said, if you reprint it, you're essentially showing people what a mirror to what, people were laughing at in 1986. And now the fact that it's sort of, and I thought, yeah, that's a valid point. And what I also started thinking, it made me reflect back to, indulge me on a little tangent here. It also flashed me back to when I was a kid, and, my parents would watch All in the Family. And there was an episode in All in the Family, and it always stuck with me, where Archie gets into an argument with Mike over hijacking airplanes. And Archie's solution I could stop, he literally, I can end all hijackings right away. And he's like, how, Archie? And he's like, arm the passengers. And I even remember as a kid, I don't know, we were 12 or 13 when I saw this, thinking that was hilarious, getting how stupid that was.
Mm-hmm.
And yet now there is a contingent of people who are shouting, yeah, well, we can get rid of school shootings, just arm the teachers. And I think to myself, what was satire at one point has now become reality. And so I think it is good to see the things that people thought were funny, because then you get a comparison. You get a mirror into, like, wow, things really have gotten that bad.
Mm-hmm.
So that was sort of the shift in my thinking on it, which was, yeah, I guess it is a good point that if you just don't look back at those things, it's that slow normalization that happens. And so that was sort of what made me kind of change my position on it. And Rich Hedden, to a degree too, he was kind of in the same camp as me. And when It's Alive approached us about doing the Roachmill thing, we had a big talk on the phone about it, and we went over very much these points. I mean, because I don't want Roachmill to come out and seem like it's sort of glib in terms of what's going on in this country, because there's very few people who look at it more seriously than I do. I've always been sort of pro gun control in terms of like smart legislation. And so I don't want people to think that it's anything but something created back in the 80s to sort of mock, take a little poke at not only comics. I mean, look at the movies of the 80s. I mean, it was really the explosion of, gun revenge, every Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, I mean, all the way up to Die Hard. And, it really was. It was the gun era of movies. And so it was a response to those things. So,
So what are you offering as, rewards for backing the project?
Well, I mean, we're offering a hardcover version of the reprint. They're going to be all digitally cleaned up. It's Alive assures me, they're going to look really, really, stellar. There's going to be they can buy all the issues individually, with new variant covers on each of them, and they can also get then along with it the collected edition, hardcover collected edition. There's going to be a signed version that we're offering, and you can buy various tiers. You can buy each individual issues. You could buy the collected edition. You could buy the signed collected edition, or you can get the whole thing where you get all the individual issues with the variant covers and the collected edition as well. So
cool. And it looks like you have the pledge levels are very reasonable. So there's
yeah, I
something.
didn't set those. That's the publisher's. That was the publisher's call. I was like, I'm just the Kickstarter is the publisher's thing. He's the one who came to me and he said, look, I want to get some good variant covers. And in order to get good variant covers, you have to I'm the one actually who said, I don't want anybody doing a variant cover for Roachmill for free.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. Artists need to be paid. I said, I'm more than willing to be involved with this as long as you can guarantee me you're going to pay these people to do these covers. So that's when he said, well, then we probably have to run a Kickstarter. And I'm like, okay, then we'll run a Kickstarter, I'm a big proponent for, nobody doing anything for free.
Oh, definitely. So has there been anything that maybe we haven't covered that, didn't ask you about that you wanted to, kind of say or let everybody know about?
No, I mean, that's about it. I mean, what's your favorite comic?
That I'm
not necessarily currently. Could be what's the comic you've read that's left a big impression on you that
probably Jeff Lemire's The Underwater Welder.
Wow, I've never heard of it. Who published it?
I think it's Top Shelf.
Okay.
So
The Underwater Welder.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, I grew up reading more a DC person.
Right.
My older brother was the Marvel collected the Marvel books. I got into DC, and I'd always sneak in and read his Marvel books.
Right.
But
when I worked for DC, there was a very interesting thing about DC. Again, it was 88, so 88, 89, and or 90 rather. So the thing that was always weird to me about DC when I worked there was, as a kid, I told you I was a Marvel head, but I, was certainly exposed to DC. There was the reruns of the Superman TV show and Batman TV show. I did buy DC comics. I did see them around. So I was always more of a Superman fan because, Superman had powers, and that was sort of what attracted me to comics. And whenever I'd go to DC, it was so odd to me that they viewed Superman, who was their flagship character, as sort of like the embarrassing uncle they didn't want to talk about. And Batman, on the other hand, was everything. So I'd be in an editorial meeting with somebody, and somebody come in and be raving about this sort of latest Batman project and blah, blah, blah. And I'd just be like, yeah, that's great. But, I've always been more of a Superman fan. And then you'd hear the needle scratch across the record. it was this such a clear vibe. Oh yeah, well, we don't. And it always was weird to me because to me, for lack of starting a massive flame war, I've never been a massive Batman fan. I would say there was about a 5-year period where, starting with Miller's Dark Knight, where I thought they did a lot of great stuff with him. But eventually it all just starts becoming the same. And, I always thought the character was incredibly limited. And the worst part about Batman for me is that character in that universe. because I'm sitting there going, the sort of backflips they have to do to sort of make that character plausible in a world full of Martians and goddesses and a guy who can run faster than the speed of light. I'm sitting there going, yeah, it's like, it's like the guy who's like, hey, wait for me.
Yeah.
I want to play on your basketball team too. Hey guys, so it's like, I always had issues, he's great. I always thought he was great in his own world where he fought sort of his low street level crime. But Batman just, after a while, he just doesn't hold a lot of interest to me. In that universe in particular, So, but I like I said, it was DC had a very, very interesting. There was a clear bias at that time. Again, could be completely different now, but there was a complete bias that Batman was on the throne, he was the king, and Superman, just we shouldn't really talk about Superman too much.
So, do you have like one final pitch, for the Kickstarter that,
Well,
and it include if you have any social media links or.
Well, it's on Kickstarter. You can follow It's Alive on Facebook, and there's links galore on there. You can follow me on Facebook and get links there, or Instagram. Just my name. And the basic pitch for me is, if you were a fan of the book or if you're unfamiliar with the book, the one thing I will say is that, and I think this does need to be said, especially for people who've never read Roachmill, it's that, I mentioned earlier, we were 20 years old. We were essentially being given the sort of keys to our own little kingdom. And for good or bad, Roachmill is almost completely untethered to any kind of editorial restraint. And I don't mean that in a sort of like, oh, we went X-rated or, it's such a product of Rich Hedden and I. Like, no editor stepped in and went, hey, you shouldn't do this. This is a little weird and a little out there. If we felt like doing it, we did it. And again, I think that's the kind of thing that you just don't see as much anymore. Maybe it's coming back a bit now that there's so many more sort of smaller publishers, but at the time it was there. I always say, you love or hate Roachmill, there was no other comic quite like it in 86 through 90. Like, there was, and not only that, but I could see some of the influences that it wound up sort of spawning, which is, I don't know. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen the movie District 9. Yeah. In no way do I ever want to say that District 9 is a ripoff of Roachmill, but I will guarantee you that Neil Blomkamp read Roachmill at some point. There's just too many similarities to it. Like, and not only me, but other people who've read the book noticed it too. So I always felt like that, it played a part in there. I also think Roachmill kind of played a part a little bit in, we started doing stuff like breaking the fourth wall, and then 3 years later, John Byrne starts doing it on She-Hulk, almost sort of direct. We had a cover where one of the characters is sort of vandalizing the cover as if he's self-aware that he's in a comic. And, first issue of She-Hulk is her holding up a comic saying, buy this book. She's aware that she's in a comic. There's a character in Roachmill called Zulu, who's a rival exterminator. And there's no doubt, in my mind, directly or indirectly. I never want to accuse anybody of a direct ripoff, because things just sort of happen. Was to some degree or another an influence on Deadpool. As a matter of fact, I had a friend, wasn't reading the comics at the time when Deadpool showed up. Another friend alerted me. It's like, hey, this character's a lot like Zulu in that he's just, wacky and crazy. And as Deadpool progressed, much like Zulu, he became that he became self-aware that he's in a comic character with a bunch of other comic book other characters. And a lot of that was already on Roachmill in 87, 88. We were doing stuff like that. So it's this weird sort of record of its time, but you can sort of see things in it that like, oh, that, that went on and became this thing, or, and I think that's what's kind of cool about it to people who've never read it. You could see the stuff we were borrowing from that came before us, which was Will Eisner, Frank Miller, a little bit of Mad Magazine, a little bit of Warner Brothers cartoons. Like it literally is a melting pot of influences, but then you can kind of see the stuff that sort of stuck moving forward onto other, projects and other things. So that would be if you haven't read it. If you're a fan of the book, I would just say, this is probably the last chance you're gonna get to see potentially new material down the road. That Rich and I aren't getting any younger, so this is sort of like where we figure, let's see what happens. If it's doable and it works, we'll head in that direction. If not, then we know the answer.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time and chatting, and look forward to the
Thanks for having me.
the Kickstarter, and best of luck with
Yep.
you have 2 weeks tonight, and it looks like you're doing really well at the moment, and are definitely going to need.
We started off strong. It's been a little flat the last few days, but that's all right. Hopefully, hopefully this will help, and the other promotional stuff we're doing. But yeah, no, it's been nice.
I think that's the kind of trend with Kickstarters is you get the ebb and flow, and not that I've ever done one, but
right. The nicest thing, honestly, has been the response from like professionals that I had no idea had even read Roachmill. Like Richard Pace did
I saw that, yeah.
And he actually reached out to us, and I was like, I'm not gonna lie, he commented on one of my Facebook posts about it, and I wasn't 100% sure he was serious. Like I thought he was kind of goofing maybe a little bit, because we had some interactions on Facebook, and Richard's got a good sense of humor, so I wasn't totally sure whether he was serious. But we've had quite a few. We have other ones lined up for some really good talent, and that's why it would be a shame if this Kickstarter fails. You're never going to see these other covers by these some really good names, but that's been really, really heartwarming, because we did this book a long time ago. We weren't really sure if anybody was interested in it other than us. We were writing it for ourselves, we were amusing ourselves, and so it was very, very moving to have these people reaching out, sort of like, hey, I want to be part of this, I want to be involved with it. And I'm like, wow, that's really, really cool. If anything, it was worth it for that.
Well, best of luck to you, and you're welcome back. And if you guys decide to do another volume or whatever, I'd love to have you come back, and we can talk about those.
Yep, hopefully that'll be the case.
All right, well, have a good day, and thanks again. Stay safe.
Thanks a lot,
healthy.
Chad.
Yep.
All right. Bye-bye.